You feel the cold marble beneath your knees before you understand where you are. The air smells of perfume and wine, but underneath it's something sharper. Fear around you. Men in silk togas lean forward, their eyes hungry, their laughter too loud. And then you see him, the boy at the center of the room, dressed in white bridal silks that cling to his trembling frame, his face painted like a woman's, his eyes empty. The Emperor Nero takes his hand, and the crowd erupts in applause. That sounds more like hysteria. This is not a play. This is a wedding. And the bride is a boy who was whole yesterday, but is not whole anymore. Before we step deeper into this nightmare, I'd love to know where you're watching from. It amazes me every time that stories like this one, buried for centuries, somehow find you across oceans and time zones. The year is 67 AD, and Rome stands at the zenith of its power. From the deserts of Judea to the mists of Britannia, the empire stretches like a living organism, pulsing with wealth, blood, and ambition. At its heart sits Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, a man who believes himself not just emperor, but artist, actor, god. He has already murdered his mother. He has watched Rome burn and sung poetry over the flames. But tonight, in the marble halls of the Palatine Palace, he will do something that even jaded Roman historians will struggle to describe without disgust. He will marry a boy named Sporus, not as a joke, not as theater, as his empress. And to make that fantasy real, he has ordered surgeons to castrate the child, to reshape his body until it resembles Papaya Sabina, Nero's dead wife, the woman he may have killed himself in a fit of rage. Suetonius records the event with barely concealed revulsion. Cassius Dio calls it an abomination. But neither dares to imagine what Sporus felt as the knife descended, as his screams echoed through corridors where no one would come to save him. Because in Nero's Rome, the emperor's desire was law, and the human body was merely another canvas. The procedure itself was butchery, dressed as surgery. Roman medicine had no anesthesia beyond wine and opium, no understanding of infection, no concept of consent. Castration could mean the removal of the testicles alone, or in more complete cases, the severing of everything that marked a boy as male. Both carried the risk of hemorrhage, shock, or slow death by fever. Sporus survived, though we will never know at what cost. What we do know is that his survival condemned him to something worse than death. Visibility: Nero paraded him through the streets of Rome, dressed in the robes of an empress, carried in a litter like Papaya had been. Addressed with her name, her titles, her honors, senators bowed, citizens whispered, and Sporus, his voice forever high, his body forever altered, stood beside the emperor as living proof that Nero could bend reality itself to his will. But here is where the story fractures into something even darker. This was not love. It was not even lust, not entirely. It was a performance of absolute power. By forcing Sporus into the role of a dead woman, Nero was declaring to Rome, I can resurrect the dead. I can unmake a boy and remake him as my bride. I can violate every custom, every law, every boundary of nature, and you will applaud. And they did, because to refuse was to die. The wedding ceremony itself was elaborate, grotesque in its attention to detail. Dio describes a full bridal procession, complete with dowry, veil, and witnesses. Sporus was given a household attendance, jewelry. He was treated, at least in public, as if he were truly the Empress of Rome. But behind closed doors, what did Nero see when he looked at this boy? Did he see Papaye's ghost-made flesh? Or did he see only his own power reflected back, the ultimate proof that nothing, not death, not nature, not the body itself, could resist him? And Sporus, the sources are silent on his thoughts. We hear his footsteps in the historical record, see his shadow in the descriptions of banquets and processions, but his voice is gone. He becomes an object, a symbol, a warning, yet traces of his humanity leak through. When Nero fell from power in 68 AD, dragged down by rebellion and paranoia, Sporus did not die with him. He survived. And that survival tells us something crucial. He wanted to live. Despite everything, despite the knife and the veil and the emperor's bed, some part of him still clung to existence. But Rome would not let him rest. After Nero's suicide, Sporus passed into the hands of Otho, the next emperor, who took him as a companion. Then came Vitellius, who saw in Sporus not a person but a prop for his own twisted spectacle. Vitellius planned to force Sporus to reenact the rape of Proserpina in a public theater. To play the role of the goddess dragged into the underworld and violated, it was then, faced with this final humiliation, that Sporus chose death. He opened his veins rather than endure one more performance, one more transformation of his body into imperial entertainment. The Roman historians record his suicide briefly, almost as an afterthought, but it echoes louder than any of Nero's grand gestures. Sporus had survived the surgeon's blade, the emperor's fantasy, the mockery of the court. But he could not survive Rome's endless appetite for cruelty. His death closes one chapter, but the book remains open, because Nero's act was not an isolated aberration. It was a door kicked open, revealing what emperors could do once freed from all restraint. 20 years later, under Domitian, that door swung wider. Domitian styled himself as Jupiter incarnate, stern and divine, a ruler who demanded absolute submission. Unlike Nero, he did not dress his cruelty in theatrical spectacle. He made it institutional. Suetonius writes that Domitian surrounded himself with castrated boys, not as lovers, but as symbols of his power to unmake men. They moved through his palace like ghosts, their smooth faces and unbroken voices a constant reminder that the emperor could strip away masculinity itself. Imagine attending one of Domitian's banquets. The hall is lit by lamps that flicker like funeral candles. The couches are arranged around a black marble table, and from the shadows, silent boys emerge to pour wine, to serve dishes, to refill cups. They never speak. Their eyes never meet yours. Their very existence whispers, "This is what happens when the emperor looks your way." Cassius Dio claims that Domitian delighted in this atmosphere of fear, that he would remind senators their sons were never safe, that any household could be entered by imperial decree. Whether these stories are entirely true or exaggerated by hostile historians, their consistency across sources suggests a pattern. For Domitian, the castrated boy was not just a servant. He was a weapon of psychological warfare. The cruelty extended beyond private chambers. Suetonius recounts that Domitian once staged mock battles at his villa on Lake Albano, where dwarfs and eunuchs were forced to fight each other to the death with blunted weapons. The crowd roared with laughter as mutilated bodies stumbled and bled, their suffering transformed into entertainment. The spectacle was both absurd and horrifying, a parody of gladiatorial combat that reduced human beings into grotesque playthings. The silence of the eunuchs themselves is the most chilling absence in the record. We hear their footsteps, see their shadows in the descriptions of historians, but their own voices are gone. They appear as objects of ridicule, props, in Domitian's theater of fear, never as people. When Domitian was assassinated in 96 AD, stabbed by his own court officials, Rome exhaled in relief. But the pattern had already been established. The castrated boy was now part of the imperial world. What Nero had begun in spectacle, Domitian had normalized in terror, and the line of succession would only carry it further. The next great leap into horror came under Commodus, the son of Marcus Aurelius. Commodus inherited the throne in 180 AD. If Marcus represented the philosopher emperor, wise and restrained, Commodus embodied its opposite. He reveled in debauchery and blood, in transforming the imperial palace into his personal amphitheater. From the moment Commodus donned gladiator's armor, he saw the entire empire as his stage. And in that theater, castrated boys became props of humiliation. Cassius Dio, who served as a senator during Commodus' reign, writes with barely contained disgust. He records that Commodus maintained entire troops of mutilated boys and men, forcing them to participate in his games. Some were made to fight animals, others to perform obscene parodies of mythological stories. One account describes Commodus dressing a eunuch boy as Ganymede, the beautiful youth abducted by Zeus, then forcing the boy into staged embraces while the court looked on. The sensory details of these spectacles are almost unbearable to imagine, the stench of sweat and blood filling the amphitheater, the roar of the crowd as boys too young to wield a sword were shoved into combat, their high-pitched cries echoing against the stone. The emperor himself, resplendent in gladiator's garb, laughing as if he were not ruler of the Roman world, but master of a cruel circus. Unlike Domitian, who used eunuchs as symbols of fear, Commodus used them as toys. He staged elaborate scenes where their mutilation was not hidden, but displayed. The Historia Augusta describes how Commodus delighted in degradation. One story claims he once lined the palace halls with castrated youths dressed as women, forcing senators to walk through them as if passing through a brothel. The choice of Ganymede as a recurring motif was no accident. In Greek myth, Ganymede was the Trojan boy abducted by Zeus to serve as cupbearer to the gods. For Romans steeped in this mythology, seeing eunuch boys forced to play Ganymede sent a clear message. Commodus was Zeus, the emperor god entitled to take and unmake whoever pleased him. And yet behind the laughter of the crowds, there was always unease. Romans despised Eastern practices of castration, branding them as unmanly and barbaric. But when the emperor himself embraced them, no one could object. The contradiction gnawed at the fabric of Roman identity. Senators muttered in private. Historians scribbled in secret. But in public they applauded, because to oppose Commodus was to invite death. By the time Commodus was strangled in his bath on the last day of 192 AD, Rome had endured 12 years of degradation. The city stank of blood both in the amphitheater and in the palace. And once again the eunuchs remained behind, silent reminders of what emperors had done to them. But even Commodus was not the end. The spiral of cruelty continued, reaching perhaps its most grotesque expression half a century later under the young emperor Elagabalus. Born in Syria, raised as a high priest of the sun god Elgabal, this boy emperor ascended the throne at only 14. His reign from 218 to 222 AD was short but notorious. Even in the scandal-filled annals of Rome, Elagabalus stands apart. Where Nero used castration to resurrect a dead wife, where Domitian used it to enforce fear. And Commodus used it for parody. Elagabalus used it for religion. The Historia Augusta, for all its biases, records shocking details. Elagabalus surrounded himself with mutilated youths, not as attendants, but as fellow worshippers in his cult of the sun. He sought to abolish traditional Roman gods, elevating his Eastern deity above Jupiter himself. And in this cult, castration became a form of sacrifice. Imagine stepping into one of his ceremonies, the temple lit with crimson draperies, incense thick in the air, the pounding of drums echoing against stone walls. Boys with shaved heads and mutilated bodies moving in trance-like rhythm, offering their blood as symbols of devotion. At the center, Elagabalus, clad in golden robes, raises his arms to the sun. The emperor's face gleams with sweat, his voice shrill, almost ecstatic. The court watches in horror, yet dares not intervene. Dio claims Elagabalus even considered castrating himself, aspiring to embody the androgynous priests of his god. He instead inflicted the rite on others, demanding their mutilation as proof of loyalty. To the conservative Roman elite, this was not just sacrilege, it was an abomination that mocked their identity as conquerors, as men, as Romans. But the emperor was unstoppable. For 4 years, he drowned Rome in ritual and humiliation. Castrated boys became not just servants or toys, but holy symbols of his new world order. The backlash was inevitable. In 222 AD, the Praetorian Guard turned on Elagabalus, dragging him through the streets and mutilating his corpse before throwing it into the Tiber. His cult was erased, his memory damned. Yet the echoes of his reign lingered in the stories of those boys whose bodies bore the mark of his fanaticism. From Nero's grotesque wedding to Elagabalus' blood-drenched rituals, the pattern is clear. Castrated boys had become a canvas on which emperors painted their darkest fantasies. Whether through love, fear, parody, or religion, each ruler used mutilated bodies to display the same truth. In Rome, the emperor's will was law, and no boundary, neither moral nor natural, could stand against it. But we must remember the silence. The boys themselves left almost no record. They appear in our sources as shadows, as punchlines, as nameless attendants. Sporus is an exception, remembered because his humiliation was so spectacular. But how many others, unnamed and unseen, bled on the surgeon's table, screamed in ritual halls, died in arenas? Archaeology offers faint traces. In catacombs beneath Rome, skeletons have been found with pelvic damage consistent with early castration. Their bones reveal stunted growth, fragile structures, evidence of hormonal disruption. These are not the proud remains of gladiators or senators. They are the quiet testimony of boys whose bodies were altered before manhood. Their graves tell no names, but their bones whisper of the knife. Historians debate the numbers. Some argue eunuchs in Rome were rare, imported luxuries from the East. Others suggest that by the time of Diocletian and Constantine, they were everywhere in the palace system. What is beyond dispute is that emperors themselves set the precedent. Nero had made castration visible, unavoidable. Domitian turned it into a tool of fear. Commodus laughed as mutilated boys reenacted myths. Elagabalus sanctified it, and their successors inherited the legacy. By the time of Constantine and the Christian Empire, eunuchs had become woven into the fabric of Roman power. They advised emperors, controlled access to the throne, managed treasuries. What began as Nero's grotesque spectacle had become bureaucracy. But beneath every robe was the same body a boy cut before manhood, shaped by imperial decree. The torches of Nero's palace have long since burned out. The amphitheaters where Commodus laughed are ruins. The temple of Elagabalus is dust. but the shadows they cast still stretch into our present. These stories feel distant, trapped in marble and ancient scrolls, yet the lesson is not buried. Power unchecked has always sought the bodies of the young. The temptation to control, to break, to reshape has not vanished with the passing of centuries. It adapts, hides behind new masks, new languages, new institutions. No parent in Rome thought their child was safe when the emperor looked their way. And that fear, that knowledge, that innocence could be violated by decree haunted every household from the Palatine to the slums of Subura. The senators who applauded at Nero's wedding knew their own sons could be next. The citizens who laughed at Commodus' games understood the implicit threat. The priests who bowed before Elagabalus' altar recognized that religious devotion could be weaponized against the flesh of children. So let these stories unsettle you. Let them disturb your comfort. Let them sharpen your awareness of how easily innocence can be exploited when no one dares to speak, because the palace torches of Rome may have burned out long ago. But if you listen closely through the cracks of history, through the silence of bones and forgotten graves, you can still hear them. The sharp intake of breath before the knife, the cry in the arena, the whispered prayer in a foreign tongue, the footsteps of boys moving through marble halls, their shadows longer than their lives. These are not just stories of emperors, they are the stories of boys who were unmade, their lives rewritten by the lust, fear, and ambition of the most powerful men in the world. And their silence, that terrible silence, echoes still.